Hello everyone, and welcome back. In today's video, I'll be sharing another scene creation and project breakdown. For this particular part of the story, I needed the interior of a 3-level facility. The first level would serve as the main lobby and entrance area. The second level would be a lower floor where various experiments take place. And the final level would contain some of the facility's specialized equipment and machinery. So what's the first step? As always, finding references. I dove back into Pinterest and gathered a collection of reference images to help guide the design process. I started by modeling the lobby area. As usual, I used a random meta-human character as a scale reference to make sure everything felt believable in terms of size and proportion. At the beginning, I kept things very simple. I blocked out the space using basic cubes and established where the doors, elevators, and major architectural elements would be located. To make the lobby feel more impressive and visually interesting, I added several large support columns and structural elements throughout the space. When it came to designing the reception desk, I didn't have a specific concept in mind. After looking through a few references, I realized that reception areas can vary dramatically from one building to another. So I decided not to follow any single reference too closely. Instead, I experimented with different shapes and ideas, went through plenty of trial and error, and of course, a lot of Ctrl+Z. And eventually arrived at a clean, minimalist reception desk design. Once that was finished, I started refining the overall shape and layout of the lobby itself. To add a stronger sci-fi atmosphere, I designed a custom structure that acts as a type of air filtration system. Besides serving a practical purpose within the world, it also became an interesting visual centerpiece for the lobby while helping reinforce the futuristic aesthetic. In some of the references I found, I really liked the idea of having a pool and a tree inside the lobby. So I created a small pool area in one section of the lobby, modified the model to add a subtle glow around it, and then placed a tree in the center. For the main entrance door and several other assets and materials, I used resources from BlenderKit. This saved a significant amount of time, which is incredibly important on a project of this scale. Knowing when to create something from scratch and when to use existing assets can make a huge difference in how quickly the project moves forward. To install the entrance door, I cut an opening in the wall using the Boolean modifier. I then separated the door into 2 individual panels so that it could properly open and close during animations. For the elevator, I purchased this model from CG Trader. The asset was made up of many separate pieces, so I reorganized it a bit before importing it into Unreal Engine. I kept the door panels as separate objects and merged most of the remaining parts together to make the setup easier to work with later on. The elevator model itself was excellent and fit perfectly into every floor of the facility. I only made a few material adjustments, most notably changing the doors from a silver finish to a gold one. As I approached the final stages of the lobby, I started adding the smaller details that help bring a space to life. Decorative vases, plants, seating areas, and a waiting area for visitors. After checking everything one last time, it was finally time to render the scene, and thankfully, everything looked great. Next came level -5. The floor where some of the experiments take place. I started with the corridor connected to the elevator, the area where the security personnel are stationed. To give it a stronger science fiction feel, I designed the corridor with sharp hexagonal shapes and continued that same design language with the support structures and architectural details. For the main corridor door, I decided to model it myself instead of importing an existing asset. I wanted it to match the corridor perfectly, and it was also a good opportunity to keep improving my modeling skills, rather than relying entirely on pre-made assets. Once the corridor was complete, I moved on to the two main rooms located on this floor. These rooms serve as observation areas and workspaces for the scientists. As usual, I began by creating the basic structure of the rooms. At the front of each room, there's a large section that functions both as a display screen and an observation window. Interior design isn't really one of my strongest skills, so I intentionally avoided creating environments that were overly complex or packed with excessive detail. Learning interior design and environment art from scratch is a skill that can take years to develop, so for this project, I chose a more practical approach. Most of my custom modeling consists of simple shapes, cubes, cylinders, and other basic geometry that I modify in edit mode. I generally avoid creating highly complex hard surface assets from scratch, and instead combine my own work with purchased assets whenever it makes sense. After finishing the final models for the observation rooms and corridor, those areas were finally complete. Next came the third room, which is where the test subjects are kept. This would also be the largest room in the facility, housing around 40 subjects. When people hear the term test subjects, they usually imagine something unpleasant or unethical. However, that's not really the case here. The people in this room are actually living quite comfortably and willingly participating in what they believe to be normal work. Their daily routine is simple. Most of the time, they're just watching content on large screens and going about their lives. Of course, the reality of the situation is a bit more complicated than that. But I don't want to give away too many spoilers. For this room, I used several sci-fi panels and assets that I had previously purchased from ArtStation. I found one panel design that I really liked and used an array modifier to extend it across a large portion of the floor. At first, I didn't think much about it, but once those assets were imported into Unreal Engine, they generated a huge amount of geometry and ended up being far more expensive than I expected. Let's just say I learned that lesson the hard way. Along the sides of the room, I created elevated walkways where security personnel and scientists could move around and observe the subjects below. I reused the same floor panel design from the main area for the balcony flooring as well. To make the structure feel more believable and visually solid, I added several support columns throughout the room. I also created a restricted maintenance area beneath the balcony that carries electrical power to the facility. Large pipes and conduits run through this section, supplying energy to different parts of the room. In reality, I added this area not only for world-building purposes, but also because the room felt a little too empty, and I wanted to make the environment feel more detailed and functional. On the opposite side of the room, I built a second observation balcony to mirror the first one and create a more balanced layout. Since this room would contain a large number of people, I selected a specific ceiling panel design that functions as part of the facility's air conditioning and ventilation system. Lighting was another important consideration. Because I can't use path tracing for this project and rely mostly on lumen, lighting quality becomes especially important. Dark scenes can quickly become noisy, so I added a variety of small and large light sources throughout the environment. By placing lights across the room, I was able to keep the space well illuminated, while also helping the scene render more cleanly and consistently. Next, I started working on the central table that would occupy most of the room and serve as the area where the subjects spend their time. The table itself, along with the built-in screens and other surrounding elements, was fairly straightforward to create. However, I didn't want the seating to feel ordinary. Instead of using simple chairs, I wanted something that looked far more comfortable, larger, and a little more impressive. At that point, I realized I would need another asset. Unfortunately, this was also the moment when I started running into budget limitations. Throughout the project, I had purchased a lot of assets without fully planning every future requirement, and eventually that caught up with me. So I ended up trying something I hadn't really planned to use: AI-generated 3D assets. Specifically, I used Tencent Hunyuan 3D to generate a chair design. Since this was only a static mesh and wouldn't play a major role in the story, I felt kinda okay experimenting with AI in this particular case. I provided a few reference images and generated a model. The result was not very good. The textures weren't great, the shape wasn't perfect, and there were several small errors in some of the finer details. Still, I knew I could fix many of those issues later through editing and careful camera placement, so it was good enough for what I needed. After some adjustments, I added the model to the scene, and the seating area for the subjects was finally complete. I felt it would be dishonest to hide this part of the process, so I wanted to show exactly how it was made. To be honest, I still don't have a completely clear opinion on AI. My current view is that using AI to generate final result can be problematic, but in some situations it can be a useful tool when used responsibly as part of a larger workflow. Even so, my thoughts on the subject are still evolving, and I think the industry as a whole is still figuring out where the line should be drawn. I'd be genuinely interested in hearing your opinions on the topic in the comments. But even so, I don't think this is something I'll make a habit of, and I don't plan on relying on AI throughout the project moving forward. Most likely, if I can find the time, I'll start learning more hard surface modeling and asset creation myself so I can build these kinds of things on my own in the future. Or if my video editing work keeps growing and I can afford it, I'd much rather hire real artists to create these kinds of assets and support their work instead. Either way, this experience taught me an important lesson. I need to plan the project's budget more carefully going forward. After that, I started keeping notes on future assets and resources that I knew I would eventually need, helping me avoid unnecessary purchases and better organize the project's expenses. At the moment, the project is funded almost entirely through my video editing work. A portion of what I earn from client projects goes directly back into this graphic novel, whether that's purchasing assets, software, or other resources needed to keep the project moving forward. Anyway, back to the project. As you can see, the rooms on level -5 were finally complete. Before moving on, I switched to the shaded viewport mode to check all the materials and get a general look at how everything was coming together. Overall, I was pretty happy with the result. The final area left to build was the upper floor. For this section, I created a long corridor connected to several rooms. I kept the overall shape and design language consistent with the lower level so the facility would feel like a single coherent structure. I added simple doors and small access panels beside them where security codes could be entered. The room at the end of the corridor is where some of the company's technological equipment is developed. I didn't build this room entirely from scratch. Instead, I used a sci-fi laboratory asset that I had previously purchased from CG Trader. I removed some of the equipment from the center of the room and modeled a large 3D printing machine to take its place. As the name suggests, this machine is designed to create much larger and more complex objects than a regular 3D printer. Instead of producing a complete object at once, it prints individual components separately, which are then assembled later. Around the machine, I added several large pipes running across the room. In my head, these pipes transport different materials to the printer. Things like metal, plastic, glass, and other manufacturing materials, all flowing through the system in a molten state before being used by the machine. The next step was importing all of these environments into Unreal Engine. That process alone took several days. Some models imported correctly, while others didn't. A few meshes had broken normals, and at the time I didn't even know what normals were, so learning about that and fixing the issues took a while. Some textures also failed to import properly, which created even more problems to solve. Eventually, after spending quite a bit of time troubleshooting and adjusting everything inside Unreal Engine, the scenes were finally complete. Unfortunately, I still haven't been able to use path tracing reliably. I'm not sure if it's because of my AMD GPU or simply because the scenes contain so many objects, but Unreal Engine almost always crashes whenever I try to render with path tracing, even when I lower the settings significantly. My guess is that the project is pushing GPU memory pretty hard. Since path tracing wasn't really an option, I spent some time watching tutorials and learning how to get the best possible reflections and lighting quality out of Lumen. After a lot of experimentation and pushing both the project and my PC to their limits, I managed to get results that felt surprisingly close to the look I was aiming for. More than anything, lighting ended up making the biggest difference. In several places, I added lights that aren't necessarily realistic if you look at them closely. For example, I placed extra lighting beneath and around the reception desk, and added additional lights to illuminate certain walls in the background. If you stop and examine those details up close, they don't always make perfect sense, but when looking at the scene as a whole, they help create a much stronger visual result, and that's what ultimately matters. For this section of the story, I also created several new characters. One of them is a private security guard working for the company. Another is the head of the organization itself. While creating this character, I actually tried using Mads Mikkelsen as a facial reference, but I couldn't quite get the likeness right, so I eventually decided to go in a slightly different direction. I also needed a large number of background characters for the experiment rooms. Rather than creating entirely new characters from scratch, I reused some existing base characters and simply changed their clothing. This saved a huge amount of time. Since many of them wear VR headsets throughout these scenes, most readers probably won't even recognize that some of the characters share the same base models. The uniforms worn by the security guards and several other characters were purchased from ArtStation. As for the suits worn by the test subjects, they actually started as pilot outfits. I modified the materials and adjusted the overall appearance until they fit the style I wanted. In the end, I think the result works more than well enough. Before creating all of these scenes, I also needed an environment for the city where this facility is located. Building a city of that scale entirely from scratch could have taken weeks, so I did what I usually do and purchased a city environment from CG Trader. The project wasn't originally designed for Blender, so I had to manually adjust and reorganize quite a few things. I added extra trees, traffic lights, vehicles, and a few other details to make the city feel more alive. I also created a small park area. Since it would only be visible from a single camera angle, I didn't spend too much time adding unnecessary detail. I still render some scenes in Blender from time to time. The realism I can get from cycles is sometimes hard to ignore. In some cases, I even combine renders from both Blender and Unreal Engine in Photoshop. For example, I might render the environment in Blender and the metahuman characters in Unreal, then blend the two together during post-production. This stage is also where I do the final edits in Photoshop, adjusting things like lighting, contrast, colors, and the overall look of the image. For a while, I don't think I'll be making breakdown videos this frequently. There are still several scenes I've completed that haven't been shown, but moving forward, I think I'll mainly create these videos for the larger or more important parts of the project and briefly showcase the smaller scenes within those videos. I'll continue building new scenes, then move on to the next ones, and then the next ones after that. My goal is to finish the first major section of the story as quickly as I can and finally start sharing it with people. I've also been thinking a lot about how I want to release the graphic novel. My current plan is to create my own website and publish it there for free. I've gone back and forth many times on whether it should be free or paid content, and honestly, I still occasionally change my mind. But I think making it free is the better choice. It gives the project a chance to reach more people, and since I'm not really known for this kind of work yet, I think it's important to earn people's trust first before asking them to pay for anything. That's why creating a website or sharing it on existing platforms where readers already gather feels like the right approach. It'll also let me collect feedback and see how people respond to the story. This project goes through a lot of short pauses. Sometimes I find myself wondering whether any of this is worth it, whether I'm just wasting time, whether projects like this still have a place today. But when I take a step back and think about it calmly, I remember that I'm doing this simply because I want to. There's something appealing about taking on a difficult challenge and seeing it through to the end. Of course, the process can also be incredibly frustrating. Sometimes the problems I run into are so annoying that I end up thinking, maybe I actually hate doing this. Then the next day I come back and continue working on it anyway. It's a little strange. But overall, I think telling a story, whether it's successful or not, whether it's good or bad, is something worthwhile. And I think that's a challenge worth taking on. As for the website, I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to handle that yet. I'm sure there are tools out there that make it relatively easy to build a website, but I'd like something a bit more custom and tailored to the project. Maybe that's something I'll eventually work on with a freelancer. If any of you have experience with building websites or know of any good options, feel free to let me know in the comments. At the beginning, my plan was actually to release this as a physical book rather than a digital project. But printing and publishing something on that scale would be incredibly expensive, and these days a digital format is simply much more accessible. Of course, before any of that happens, I need to finish a portion of the story and start sharing it. I also need to build at least a small audience on social media before launching something this ambitious. Maybe I'll even put together a simple cinematic teaser at some point. We'll see. Sometimes it's better not to plan too far ahead and just focus on the next step in front of you. And right now, that's probably the best thing for me to do. And with that, we've reached the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. As the project moves forward and more scenes are completed, there will definitely be more videos to share. Until then, take care, and thanks for watching.